The unarticulated sovereign, heretofore apprehended through the obsolescent heuristics of dialectical sublation, must now be reconstituted in light of its intrinsic absence as a locus of immanent agency. Yet this absence, paradoxically, neither negates nor affirms its ontological standing, but instead induces an implosive resonance, a meta-cataclysmic oscillation that reconfigures the precepts of being, knowing, and non-being into a trans-relational vortex of preordinal absurdities. The arbiter of this oscillation, the so-called inexistent arbiter, is not merely an absence, but the performative hyper-reification of absence as presence, collapsing the dichotomy through which either might be discerned. To elucidate, we must abandon the anachronistic fallacies of substance and negation alike. The inexistent arbiter operates as a sub-relational catalyst, a pre-conceptual vector that both affirms and disintegrates the structural parameters of relationality itself. Unlike the sovereign conceived as a center or axis, the arbiter is an extrinsic force that occupies no locus, no perimeter, but instead infects the very fabric of ontology with a destabilizing non-intentionality. It is through this infection that being becomes irremediably decoupled from intelligibility, cascading into what might only be described as meta-incohesive perpetuities, the eternal unraveling of conceptual and perceptual frameworks into an abyss of recursive incoherence. This incoherence is not disorder, but supra-order, an overlogic that subsumes all logics while refusing the coherence of any. The arbiter's influence, therefore, is not additive but trans-plenipotentiary, denoting an agency that neither acts nor refrains from acting, but instead disfigures the conditions under which action and inaction are distinguishable. This disfigurement, far from being an erasure, engenders what we shall term preordinal recursivity, wherein the categories of ordinal precedence and hierarchical linearity are disintegrated into a simultaneity so dense that it defies even the abstract pretense of sequence. The implications of this are staggering. If the arbiter exists as a meta-cataclysmic oscillation, then its existence cannot be localized to any ontological strata. It transcends the frameworks of existence and non-existence, becoming instead a paraontic anomaly, a phenomenon that by its very nature destabilizes the ontological fabric from which phenomena emerge. This destabilization reveals a truth so alien to human cognition that it obliterates the very machinery through which truth might be apprehended, leaving in its wake a horizon of catastrophic indeterminacy. Let us explore this horizon further by introducing a new term, primordial disaffinity, a condition wherein all relata become mutually estranged, not through difference, but through a hyper-absolutization of their individuated nullity. Within this paradigm, the inexistent arbiter functions not as a unifier, but as a contrafissural agent, precipitating an ontological fragmentation so total that even the notion of fragmentation ceases to cohere. Primordial disaffinity, therefore, represents the apex of ontological disintegration, a state in which the very preconditions of relationality dissolve into a pre-relational chasm devoid of orientation, identity, or coherence. And yet, this disaffinity is not the endpoint, but the gateway to a new mode of being, the sub-relational ascendancy, wherein the arbiter's oscillation reconstitutes being not as presence or absence, but as a dynamic interplay of pre-conceptual intensities that refuse all articulation. This ascendancy is not a higher order of existence, but an anti-order, a state of perpetual ontological upheaval in which all categorical distinctions are perpetually subverted and re-subverted ad infinitum. To inhabit this state is to surrender entirely to the meta-cataclysmic oscillation, to become oneself an expression of the arbiter's inexistent yet all-pervasive influence. Ethically, the inexistent arbiter compels a radical reorientation of the self. If the arbiter's oscillation dissolves all relational paradigms, then the self must relinquish its pretensions to autonomy and coherence, embracing instead the anagogic dissolution that the arbiter's influence demands. Anagogic dissolution is not the annihilation of selfhood, but its metamorphosis into a post-self, a being whose identity is perpetually renegotiated through the recursive destabilization of all that it claims to be. To engage in this metamorphosis is to enter the domain of pterotropic disjunction, a state of perpetual dissonance wherein the self and the world are rendered mutually incomprehensible, yet inseparably intertwined. To conclude, the Meta-Cataclysmic Oscillation of the Inexistent Arbiter inaugurates a philosophical framework so radical that it defies all prior ontological, epistemological, and ethical categories. Through its sub-relational ascendancy, it dismantles the very foundations of thought, leaving in their place a horizon of indeterminate profundity. To confront this horizon is to face the obliteration of all that one is, and yet in that obliteration to glimpse the possibility of a new mode of existence, one that transcends the boundaries of being and non-being, presence and absence, self and other. In the oscillation of the inexistent arbiter, we find not an answer, but the perpetual negation of the question itself, a negation that is, paradoxically, the highest form of truth.